to get a little political this morning, and we're going to talk about a fictitious country. Okay, we will call it constitutional land. All right. So this isn't legal advice. We're talking about a fictional country. We're going to call it constitutional land. So imagine in constitutional land that we have a government that has a legislative branch, a judicial branch, and an executive branch. Imagine in constitutional land that we have individual states with state sovereignty. Imagine this imaginary constitutional land has a president, a Supreme Court, and a Congress with a House and a Senate. Imagine this imaginary constitutional land where we have a jury trial. Okay? Remember, this ain't legal advice. What happens? So, so we have this constitutional land, and this constitutional land has a constitution. And in this constitution, it lays out what the government is allowed to do, and anything it doesn't allow it to do, it's not allowed to do. All right? So that's the situation. We have this imaginary country called constitutional land with all this stuff arranged. What happens when the government in this imaginary land doesn't abide by the restrictions imposed upon it? What is a citizen's recourse? What do you do when this imaginary government in this imaginary country usurp your rights? What's your recourse? We have a situation in this imaginary land where, let's say, they claim there's a virus, and using the virus as an excuse, the president issues a 50 statewide state of emergency and calls upon the War Powers Act to take over all communications, all banking, all supplies, all transportation, all that type of stuff. So imagine a situation like that. Imagine a situation where this imaginary government in this imaginary country forces people to stay at home without pay, just forces them to stay at home, and forces businesses to shut down arbitrarily, and forces landlords to not collect rent, and then shut the courts down so that there's no recourse for landlords to even evict. Imagine a country with a government like that. What should those citizens do? So some citizens go to a court in front of a judge, which is just part of the government, to fight the government. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. But you got to ask yourself, is that the only recourse that those citizens in this imaginary country with that imaginary government would have? Well, fortunately, this imaginary country with this imaginary government and this imaginary constitution have a right to a trial by jury. And you may be asking, so what? The purpose in this imaginary country with this imaginary government, with this imaginary trial by jury, the purpose of that jury trial is to protect you in this imaginary country from bad law. So you don't have to petition the government to change laws in order to get them to stop doing what they shouldn't be doing. But this requires um, civil disobedience. Essentially, you have to break the law. So, in this imaginary country, when they pass a law that's not in their constitution, it's called a de facto law in this imaginary country. And as such, you are not obligated to obey it. But if you're not told that, then you try and be a good citizen and just comply, and you petition your government without understanding that you don't have to obey bad laws. And our jury system is there to protect you from rogue government in this imaginary country of constitutional land. So, why that's important is in this imaginary country, there is a large group of people that their color's red. No, I take it back. It's blue. It used to be red. So this imaginary country with this imaginary political group is trying everything they can do to reduce or eliminate your right to a trial by jury if you had lived in this imaginary country. So why this is important is in this imaginary country with this imaginary constitution, it's of the people, by the people, for the people. And a jury has the power to overturn the Supreme Court itself, the decisions of the Supreme Court. A jury has the power to overturn the decrees of a president and Congress. A jury in this imaginary country is the most powerful position or group of people in this imaginary country, in this imaginary government, because it is ultimately by the people. So I'll make an extreme example. They pass a law in this imaginary country that says that having light brown hair, that's illegal. Having blue eyes is illegal. Without a jury, it's the law. Whether you like it or not, it's the law. And they arrest you for having light brown hair, dark blonde, light brown with blue eyes, and you stand before the judge. The judge says, it's the law, you're guilty, you need to go to jail. Now you know it's a ridiculous law, but it's the law. So, in this imaginary country, with this imaginary constitution, with an imaginary jury system, you can demand a jury trial and plead to your jurors that this is a ridiculous law, or on their own they just say, what? He can't help that he's got blue eyes and light brown hair. And they say, no, not guilty. Or, yeah, he's guilty, but we're going to acquit him because that's a ridiculous law. And in this imaginary country, under this imaginary government, with an imaginary jury system, that decision would be permanent for everybody. So, imagine in this imaginary country where they have public school systems, public school systems, where they don't teach you this. Instead, they teach you how to use imaginary money called fiat money, which the government inflates away, thus stealing your purchasing power, and it's a tax in this imaginary country. And they teach you that if you want to change the laws, you got to petition your government, and you got to go to the courts and fight the courts, which are this government. You got to go to the government to fight the government. And in that situation, you lose, but that's what they teach you. In these public schools, in this imaginary land, they have your children for most of the day, and they corral them, and they lock them in their schools, and they lock them in their rooms. So they basically are conditioning in this imaginary land, each generation of children in these public schools that are centralized, a central system tells them what the local schools can teach. Imagine what can be done. Imagine if somebody like Joseph Stalin or Hitler or one of the other in our world lived in a world like that and had power over a public school system like that. Just imagine what they could do. So, in our world, it's been said that George Bush, when talking about the Constitution, said it was just a goddamn piece of paper. And I don't know if that's true or not that he said that, but it's really true that it's just a goddamn piece of paper. And the reason that that's true is if you strap the Constitution, like in our world, say, if you strap the Constitution to your chest, it's not going to stop a bullet. It's not going to stop a bully. It's not going to stop the banksters. It isn't going to stop anything. So, in this constitutional land, this imaginary country with this imaginary government and imaginary constitution, we'll go back to that world, that make-believe world. In that world, those citizens need to not just know their rights, because in this imaginary world, most people don't even know their rights. They think that just because they have a constitution that they're protected, but they're not. So in this imaginary world, you not only have to know your rights, but you have to be willing to fight for them. And not just once during a revolution, but every day. Because every day in this imaginary land, there are those that are trying to usurp your rights and do things they're not allowed to do. So the first thing in changing corruption in this imaginary land would be that the average citizen needs to know their imaginary constitution. And then once they know them, they can recognize when things are going wrong and then band together in a jury system to defend those that are bold enough to civilly disobey unjust laws. Could you imagine what would change in that imaginary land? And how stuff could just change so quickly, and they could say, thus far, no more. Imagine that.